Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Kathleen Yu, English major year 3, your MC for today. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this public lecture entitled Degeneration and Regeneration After the Global Financial Crisis by Professor Niall Ferguson, Lawrence A. Teach Professor of History at Harvard. Professor Ferguson, as a token of appreciation, our college master will now present you a special souvenirs. Professor James Melise, please. Professor Ferguson, please. Thank you, professors. Please stay for group photos. May I now invite the college masters, fellows, and guests for our photo taking with Professor Ferguson, please. May I now invite our college master, Professor Melise, to have a few words with us, please.
Our speaker today is, I very seldom use the word, a distinguished historian. I have a list here of most of his books, but I should just tell you first that he was at Oxford as his first university and then stayed there for a while, but then got lured away to Harvard, or probably it's more accurate to say he decided to go to Harvard. Still has a senior research fellowship at Jesus, I believe, and professor at Harvard. This will give you a pretty good impression of what he does. Maybe the first one won't. Paper and Iron. That, I suppose, was his first book, but you could work out that he's something of an economic historian. House of Rothschild, it's quite economic. Pity of War, very interesting military history. The Cash Nexus, Empire, Colossus, the War of the World, The Ascent of Money, High Financier, Civilization. And he has done some TV documentaries and got awards for it, and he writes a column in Newsweek. Quite a busy man. We're very lucky that he's here, and I know you are going to enjoy this lecture. I am. I may not agree with it, of course. Professor Ferguson, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sir James, Jim, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. It's a momentous week in a whole range of ways, but the most obvious way for me is that the greatest British Prime Minister since Winston Churchill died yesterday. And I thought it would be appropriate, before I got down to the serious business of this lecture, to talk say a brief word about Margaret Thatcher. I spent much of last night writing a very hurried appreciation of her for the Financial Times. And I was up early this morning on a number of television chat shows continuing the discussion. Opinion will, I think, continue to be divided about Margaret Thatcher's achievement. But I don't think there can be any real disagreement about what she aimed to achieve and what her principles were. There's a wonderful story about Thatcher before she became Prime Minister in the late 1970s, in the course of a heated discussion, pulling out a copy of Friedrich Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty and banging it down on the table and saying, "This is what we believe." And I can't think of many other leaders in modern times who would have done anything like that. She had come to be, relatively late in life, intellectually galvanized by not only the ideas of Hayek, but a whole range of ideas, libertarian ideas, monetarist ideas, some from the United States, some very much homegrown, some from the country from which both Sir James and I hail, Scotland. Adam Smith was a critical component in Margaret Thatcher's political education. One of the functions performed by think tanks like the Centre for Policy Studies and the Adam Smith Institute was the education of Margaret Thatcher. And her career is a very vivid illustration, I think, of the power of ideas in politics. One of the things that Margaret Thatcher excelled at was conveying the relatively complex academic ideas of a Hayek or an Adam Smith in plain language that a working class man or woman could understand. A man's right to work as he will, to spend what he earns, to own property, to have the state as servant and not as master. These are the British inheritance. They are the essence of a free economy. And on that freedom, all our other freedoms depend. Margaret Thatcher, in 1975. Well, what I want to suggest to you this afternoon is that those plain words are a simple way of conveying a quite complex idea about the nature of freedom and about the relationship between economic freedom and other freedoms. I've given my lecture the title, Degeneration and Regeneration, in the wake of the financial crisis, because I want to talk about some of the themes in my newest book, the one that hasn't even come out in the United States yet, The Great Degeneration. The central theme of that book, and to some degree a central theme of my last book, Civilization, the West and the Rest, is the role played by institutions in the creation and preservation of freedom. So my challenge this afternoon, and it's quite a large one, is to distill the arguments in two books and relate them, as far as I am able to you, to what interests you, and specifically to the huge institutional challenges that currently confront the People's Republic of China. All of this inside an hour. First, let me set the scene. I'm sure some of you are economics majors. Put your hand up if you're an economics major, okay? This is for you. Don't be ashamed, it's like. It's normally the response I get when I say, who here is a lawyer? And they go. So this is the economic scene-setting part of the lecture. I want, in fact, not to go all the way back to the 70s now. I just want to go back 5 or 6 years. I want to go back to 2007, to be precise, and to the beginning of what Australians call the GFC, the Global Financial Crisis. Nobody else calls it that, but they do. Americans sometimes call it the Great Recession. It goes by many names. I'm going to call it the Slight Depression, as opposed to the Great Depression. And the reason I want to call it that is that it does bear comparison with 2 previous events in American economic history that go by the name of depression. The Great Depression of the 1929 to, well, when do you say it ended, the late 1930s, is the famous one. The less famous one, though people called it great at the time, happened in the 1870s. It began in 1873. And what I've done to allow you to compare depressions is I've taken the US stock market in each of these 3 crises. I have rebased it to 100 at the peak of the stock market, and I've then traced the trajectory of the sell-off and then the rally in equity prices. And what you can see is that in the first phase of our crisis, beginning in the autumn of 2007, we performed an almost perfect reenactment of the Great Depression that began in 1929. In other words, if you look at the nasty green line and compare it with the dark crimson line, they're almost identical in the initial phase. It wasn't until the summer of 2009 that you could argue with any credibility that we were not in a Great Depression. Anybody who knew any economic history saw an almost identical sequence of events and a crash not only in equity prices but also in world trade, in industrial output, that was as severe as happened after 1929. But then, as you can see, something remarkable happened. We pulled out of the tailspin and we avoided Great Depression 2.0, or strictly speaking 3.0, since this was really the 3rd depression in modern American history. And now we find ourselves just over 5 years later back where we started. So US equities just in the last week or so have recovered their pre-crisis level. And that means that it's a slight depression we've experienced. It's actually now better even than the depression of the 1870s, which, as you can see from the blue line, was never as big a shock. But in terms of its duration, certainly was great, and it took longer than it took us for the investors of the 1870s to make back what they had lost. Why was our depression slight, not great? Well, the obvious answer is that monetary policy was as different in our depression from the depression of the 1929-33 period as you could possibly imagine. I used to tell my students at Harvard to read Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's Monetary History of the United States. And I told them, read the chapter on the Great Contraction, that's the chapter on the Great Depression, and assume that Ben Bernanke will do exactly the opposite of what the Fed did then. And what you see in this chart is that this was not a bad way to think about the problem. The Fed, but not only the Fed, all the major central banks, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and belatedly, very belatedly, the Bank of Japan, all engaged in variations on the same policy theme. with all kinds of different euphemisms, they used the central bank's balance sheet to avert a Great Depression. And they did this by buying an amazing array of financial assets, not just government bonds, but in the teeth of the crisis in 2008, practically any junk that they could get their hands on, to stave off the domino-like failure of banks, which had been, at least in Friedman and Schwartz's view, the key to the Great Depression of the early 1930s. If you've ever wondered why one studies financial history, why bother with economic history, here's your answer. Because what the central banks of the world have done since 2007 is to learn from history, to seek to apply the lessons of the Great Depression. And I think that one has to commend them on what they've achieved. This seems to me the principal reason that our depression has been slight rather than great. But before we take the champagne out, which I assume we'll be doing later, let's not pretend that this problem has been solved. Lawrence Summers, my former boss at Harvard, has often used the phrase escape velocity to describe what he would like to see the United States achieving. Growth sufficiently rapid that we can say definitively, it's over. Well, if I was on a life support machine and this was the printout, you wouldn't say that my heart had achieved escape velocity. In fact, you'd be inclined to think I hadn't made it at all. The most recent numbers from the United States, the latest quarterly gross domestic product data, are discouraging. Growth is still painfully slow. And the United States is in fact performing better than the other major developed economies around the world. It's certainly performing better than the European Monetary Union, or Eurozone as it's sometimes known. It's been consistently performing better than the United Kingdom, despite the fact that, as you saw from the previous chart, the Bank of England has been in many ways as aggressive in its monetary policy as the Fed has been. So when one takes a look at this chart, it's very hard to feel confident that our slight depression is really over. One can't rule out the possibility that we have more trouble in store. Here's why. Not only did we learn lessons from Friedman and Schwartz, we also learnt lessons from John Maynard Keynes. In fact, one of the most remarkable features of this crisis from the point of view of economics has been the extraordinary resurgence that we've witnessed, at least in the public sphere, of the thinking of Keynes's general theory. Economic commentators from Paul Krugman to Martin Wolf have dusted down their copy of the 1936 general theory and have essentially regurgitated its argument, suggesting that not an enormous amount of progress has been made intellectually by Sir James's colleagues. Funnily enough, to an historian who spent a part of his time as an Oxford undergraduate reading and trying to understand the general theory, this seemed like an admission of defeat rather than a triumph of Keynes from beyond the grave. Why do I say that? Because in most developed economies, right from the outset, there was far less fiscal room for maneuver than a classical Keynesian, if that's an appropriate term, analysis would have wished. Many developed economies already had very large debt burdens, and that made it difficult for them to adopt the classical Keynesian remedy of large deficits to stimulate aggregate demand. Beginning in Southern Europe, and beginning in fact in Greece, one economy after another in the OECD has had to tighten fiscal policy where it might have preferred to keep it loose. Through the Eurozone, this spread, Outside it, in the United Kingdom, we saw the same phenomenon. And finally, even in the United States, it's been necessary to tighten fiscal policy. That's what's happening this year in the extraordinary political process that goes on in Washington. Across-the-board cuts have been imposed because there wasn't agreement on what should be done. This was the self-immolating sequester. So most developed economies are now tightening fiscal policy, which is one reason that growth is very muted in developed economies right now. I don't know if anybody here has ever read the story of Dr. Dolittle. Raise your hand if that name means anything to you. I'm just curious, actually, who's heard of Dr. Dolittle. It kind of dates me. Dr. Dolittle is a wonderful children's story written by a man named Hugh Lofting. And my favorite creature in the Dr. Dolittle story, he's the doctor who can talk to the animals. My favorite creature is the push-me-pull-you. The push-me-pull-you has two heads, one facing one way and the other facing the other way. And I would refer to our economic policies today in the developed world as push-me-pull-you policies, because monetary policy is facing one way and fiscal policy is facing the other way. And it's actually a little bit unclear which head is really in charge and which way the push-me-pull-you is going to walk. That's actually, I think, the best way of understanding what's happening in the developed world today. But now let me take a step back. It seems to me that the global financial crisis is really part of a much bigger story. It's a subplot, if you like, in the drama, in the narrative of Western decline. Future historians will look back and say, well, the global financial crisis was interesting, but it actually didn't alter the direction of economic history. That direction, dating back, indeed beyond 1989, dating back to the late 1970s, was clear. The direction of economic history from the late 1970s was for the rest of the world, led by China, to catch up with the Western economies that, for the better part of half a millennium, had dominated the globe. And in that narrative, the financial crisis of 2007 to 2013 was really not that big a deal. And that's the kind of perspective that I want you to adopt today. Rather than us spending our time in the discussion arguing about who was to blame for the global financial crisis. Was it the bankers? Was it the regulators? Whose fault was it? Let's not have that discussion, because in the end, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter. The much bigger question is, what is driving this astonishing story of convergence? What Kishore Mahbubani is called the Great Convergence, or actually what he should really have called the Great Reconvergence. I want you to savor this chart, because all the economic history is here. It's all you need to know. It takes data, well, estimates by Angus Maddison that go all the way back up to 1500. And it calculates three ratios. The ratio of US to Chinese per capita gross domestic product, the ratio of British to Indian, and the ratio of US to Brazilian, just so that you can get the big picture. Economic history from around 1500 to around 1978 was pretty straightforward. It was the story of a great divergence. The West, which essentially meant Europe, North America, and a few places where Europeans settled, like Australia, the West got much richer than everybody else. and much richer than the East. You'll notice that it's not such a dramatic disparity, the US-Brazil disparity. But the US-China disparity is astounding. By the late 1970s, by the very time that Margaret Thatcher was about to become Prime Minister, the average American was 22 times richer than the average Chinese, and that's on a purchasing power parity adjusted basis. If you just did it on current dollars, if the average Chinese had had to go live in New York on his Chinese income, he would have found himself 1/70th as rich as the average American. And that was the culminating point of the great divergence in history. And we have the privilege of living through the end of this extraordinarily unfair development in economic history. It was very unfair because a minority of humanity got much, much richer than the majority. And they didn't just get richer, they got longer lived, healthier, more powerful, you name it. The West had the advantages. And this is ending in our time. And what's more, you can see from this chart that when Madison left off, the average, on this same measure, the average American was about 5 times richer than the average Chinese. So we went from 22 times to 5 times in the time that it took me to go from being a spotty teenager to being a grumpy professor. What's more, this is not over. These projections are from the OECD, and they take the story up to 2060. Here I've done the ratios, US to China again, and Eurozone to India. If economic history carries on as the OECD expects, and the OECD is in good company because Goldman Sachs has roughly the same story, then we'll end up in a situation where by 2060, the average American will be less than twice as well off. Not quite back to where the story began, but pretty close to where it began circa 1500 or 1600. Which is pretty amazing when you come to think about it. What has happened? What has caused this astonishing reconvergence? And what could happen to spoil this chart? Those are the questions that I want you to think about this afternoon. Not whether Dick Fould was an idiot in the way that he ran Lehman Brothers. Let's relegate that to the footnotes. Let's concentrate on the big story. You all have smartphones, I'll be bound. A few hardline Luddites don't. But I know that the students all have smartphones because when I'm walking around this campus, I keep having to avoid you because this is the way that you walk. It's actually kind of hazardous because you also have your earphones in, so you can't hear me saying, "Look out." Well, the reason that I use the image of the killer applications is because I want your generation to get the point that I'm making. I have teenage children, and I realized after a while that if I talked about institutions, they kind of zoned out. But if I talked about killer apps, I had their attention. And in a way, the killer apps idea is not a bad one, because the things that I'm going to describe to you this afternoon are a bit like the apps on your phone. When you look at the icons, they look very simple, don't they? You just kind of tap on one icon and you find out what the weather's going to be like tomorrow, and you tap on another icon and you check your email. Behind each of these icons is extraordinarily complex computer code that maybe 1 in 1,000 people could reproduce or understand. Same goes for historical killer apps. The things that I'm talking about in the next 10 or 15 minutes are very simple to name, but in fact, each of the icons, each of the names, conceals an enormous complexity of evolved ideas and institutions that interact in very specific ways. So although this is a lecture, and in lectures you're allowed to simplify, and in slides like this you simplify to the point of absurdity, think of each concept that I'm talking about like an icon on your phone. They do look simple, but they're not so simple when you try to look at the code. The idea in my book, Civilization, was very simple. There were 6 things that originated in the West, 6 ideas and institutions. They didn't really happen anywhere else in the same way. And these killer apps were the things that allowed Western dominance to happen. Notice, absent from the list is empire or imperialism. You know why? Because empire was the least original thing that the West did after 1500. Everybody did empire. The Chinese did empire. The Mughals did empire. There were empires in Africa and empires in Central America and empires in the Andes. Everybody did empire. Empire is as old as recorded history. The idea that empire could explain the Great Divergence is an obvious historical error. It's like explaining the Great Divergence in terms of geography. This is the Jared Diamond mistake. The geography is the same. It's the same in the year 0, in the year 1000, in the year 1500, and this year. It's basically the same. So we can't explain the Great Divergence in terms of empires or geography, or for that matter, the weather. We need to explain it in terms of ideas and institutions, and we need to explain it in terms of things that obviously changed around about 1500 and after. And these are the things I think that we should focus on. By the way, before any economist asks me this, there's not a model that you can write. Historical explanations are not like that because the world is not a machine, and there are massively complex relationships between all of what I'm describing and non-linearities that even the most powerful supercomputer would struggle to capture. Number 1, competition. The idea that it is legitimate to have political and economic competition, legitimate, that there should be multiple states, and that within the multiple states there should be multiple e-states. The idea that London should have a self-governing corporation, the corporation of the City of London, and that that corporation should in turn be subdivided into self-governing mysteries or guilds, this idea did not originate in any other civilization but the West. In other civilizations, the emphasis was on unity, and the notion of such pluralism of institutions was highly foreign. So competition, both political and economic, is my first killer app. And you only need to look at a map of Europe circa 1500 to get the point. It's a patchwork. And all the attempts to create a unitary European empire fail, whereas in East Asia, they succeed. The scientific method. China had technology. The Muslim world, mathematics, considerable achievements in astronomy too. But the scientific method as it evolved in the 17th century, in the time of Newton, had no non-Western counterpart. The scientific revolution did not happen even in the Ottoman Empire, which was geographically very close to where the scientific revolution was happening. And the scientific revolution really matters in 1, 2, 3, 4, 100 ways, but I'll give you just one. Once you have done Newtonian physics, and once you apply it to ballistics, your artillery becomes accurate. And this is a perfect illustration of a killer app. Because the breakthroughs in gunnery, in artillery, originated in work done by a mathematician who was a member of the Royal Society. His insights in new principles of gunnery were adopted throughout the European world in a matter of a decade. And they meant that from around the 1750s, European artillery was much more likely to hit the target than anything that Asians or Africans or South Americans had. So that kind of science made a huge difference. 3, modern medicine. That's another basically Western achievement. It's modern medicine, and most of the breakthroughs come in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, that doubles and then more than doubles life expectancy. And means that there's an enormous disparity in life expectancy between the West and the rest right into the 1950s. The consumer society. Put your hand up if you have bought an article of clothing in the last month. Any article of clothing. Come on, be honest. You've not bought any clothes at all in the last month. Where did you get that nice baseball jacket? Yeah. A year ago. So you haven't bought any clothes for a year? Because those jeans are looking a little bit tired. The consumer society is basically about buying clothes. Prior to the birth of the consumer society in the British Isles in the 17th century, most people had hardly any clothes. Only rich elites had large wardrobes. Why would you bother to have an industrial revolution if you didn't have a consumer society? The only real point of the industrial revolution is to make the price of this and this much, much lower than it would be if you produced it by hand. So the Industrial Revolution is basically about cheap clothes. And what you illustrated when you nearly all except you put up your hand is that our appetite for clothing is almost infinitely elastic. If you still don't believe me, I can show you pictures of my daughter's wardrobe. We love clothes. Well, this idea of a consumer society based on lots and lots of clothes is a Western idea. And every non-Western society, beginning with Japan, that wanted to replicate the Western economic model, made clothes. It's the mass manufacturing using technology of textiles and clothing that starts the Industrial Revolution everywhere, including China. The work ethic. Let's see, this is a group mainly of students. I'm always interested to know when students get out of bed. Okay, put your hand up if you got out of bed at 6 a.m. or earlier this morning. All right, put your hand up if you got out of bed at 7 a.m. or earlier. We can keep our hands up. These lazy bums can join us. Okay. All right, let's talk about yesterday. Put your hand up if you were still working at 1 a.m. last night. So I think we've established that I'm the hardest worker here, and that you guys all work very late and laze around in the morning. The work ethic is partly about working long hours. It's partly about having the motivation to get out of bed at 6 and keep working till 1. Or some variant on that theme. And the work ethic's very important. As Max Weber understood in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, work matters. Purposeful, rational work, plus the ability to defer consumption, that was an important part of Weber's argument, matters. And finally, the thing I'm going to talk most about this afternoon is the rule of law. And in particular, the idea of the rule of law based on private property rights. So my argument is that for most of history until very recently, most of these 6 killer apps were essentially monopolized by the West. And only relatively recently have they been downloaded by the rest of the world. This process of downloading Western institutions started in Japan in the Meiji era. It didn't come to mainland China until very recently. Of course, there were some Western ideas that people downloaded early on. Unfortunately, usually really terrible ideas like communism. The West produced bad as well as good ideas. One of the challenges the Japanese had in the Meiji era was they had no idea what the good ideas were and what the bad ideas were, so they downloaded them all. The way that people dressed, the way they brushed their hair, the way they brushed their teeth, the music they listened to, the dances they did, the uniforms their sailors wore. The Japanese were very systematic in copying everything that they could copy about the West. But they had no idea which things mattered. So they also copied imperialism. And that didn't turn out very well. It's copying, downloading the right institutions and ideas that is the key to economic convergence. And it turns out that only relatively recently has the majority of people in the world had access to the right killer apps. Let me run through this briefly. Remember killer app of competition? Well, competitiveness, which is a slightly different thing, admittedly, is something that the World Economic Forum measures in a competitiveness index. It standardized this index in 2004. Between 2004 and 2012, you can track how different countries have performed in terms of their competitiveness. So here's China, mainland China, which has increased its World Economic Forum competitiveness index by about 13%. And here's the United States, where it declined by over 5%. You can mess around with comparable data sets. The story is basically the same, whatever you look at. Non-Western economies have been improving their competitiveness, and Western economies, with a few notable exceptions, have seen deterioration. Innovation, if not necessarily the scientific method as I defined it earlier, seems to be moving east too, certainly in terms of patents granted by country of origin of applicants. It's very striking that not only has Japan led the United States for actually quite a long time now, but in the relatively recent past, China has overtaken Germany, and indeed South Korea, by this measure, to take third place. By the way, this being a lecture, I have to simplify as I go along, sometimes heroically. And at each stage in this argument, some of you will have objections. And we can go into these in the discussion. This is the high-speed rail link intellectually. We're going to hurtle along and hope not to crash. This is, I think, pretty uncontroversial. The West no longer has the commanding lead it used to enjoy in healthcare, in medical science. Notice, by the way, the massive improvement that occurred in China. Going back to 1960, you still had life expectancy in the low 40s in the PRC. But the interesting thing about this chart for me is actually the remarkable performance of Japan and Hong Kong relative to the Western economies, and also the dismal performance of one European society, Russia, which actually saw a period of decline in life expectancy in the 1990s. So I don't think we could claim that the killer app of medical science is any longer monopolized by the West. Consumer society is a really interesting case. That's clearly no longer a Western monopoly, because here you have a list of the 30 biggest shopping malls in the world, and only 3 of them are in the United States. You can see from this list that a very substantial number of them are, in fact, in Asia. How full these shopping malls are is, of course, something that you can debate. But you don't need to spend too much time in Hong Kong to realize that the consumer society is alive and well and living here. fact, my overwhelming impression of Hong Kong on the basis of this visit is that it is very close to becoming one single giant shopping mall connected by public transport. And soon it will be harder and harder to find a traditional street because you'll simply be in a mall wherever you go. So the consumer society is a thing that no longer is a uniquely Western phenomenon. Indeed, with Western consumers leveraged to the point of being prostrate, it's actually non-Western consumers that are making a lot of the running in the world economy today. People in Asia work much longer hours than people in the West. My favorite illustration at this point is that the average Korean works about 1,000 hours more a year than the average German. Any Germans here? Well, this is why when we go on vacation, he's already there. And when we go home, he stays for another week. It is true, actually. I'm amazed how many Germans are in Hong Kong just on vacation right now. I'm kind of in my suit thinking, this sucks, I'm working. They're just here for fun. So the work ethic clearly doesn't live where Max Weber thought it lived. Max Weber thought it lived in Germany. Germany and the United States. It's not there anymore, at least not according to these data. But what I want to focus on in the final part of this talk, if you're still with me, is my sixth killer app, which I only briefly talked about a moment ago, and that's the rule of law. I think in many ways it's one of the most important, though I'm not really going to rank them for you, because the rule of law based on private property rights was one of the things that really distinguished the West, and especially the English-speaking West, from the rest of the world from around the 17th century. Well, what I want to suggest to you this evening is that the rule of law, like all the other killer apps, has not only been downloaded by a substantial part of the non-Western world, but more importantly for our purposes, is no longer in the healthy state that it used to be in the West. So the argument that I want to focus on in the final part of my lecture is the argument that the rule of law in the West, and specifically in the United States, is in a kind of state of degeneration. It's not healthy. And as we try to understand how China should increase the importance of law, which it's generally agreed it needs to, even at the highest levels of the party, we also need to look at what has gone wrong with the rule of law, where it used to be best established. Let me illustrate what I mean by the degeneration of the rule of law. The Internal Revenue Service, an institution with which I am sorry to say I have regular dealings, is a pathological bureaucracy. It generates regulation faster than most Americans can generate income. The IRS code is around 3.4 million words. But if you actually go and look at all the regulations that apply to the tax code, you're getting on for more than 9 million. This is a code that grew by 20% between 1995 and 2005. The complexity of the tax code is bewildering, so bewildering that most people whose incomes are remotely complex require professional accountants to prepare their tax returns. This is one of many examples that I could give you of excessively complex legislation and regulation. And this is the first part of the problem with the rule of law in the United States. If you want another example, look at the Dodd-Frank Financial Services Regulation Bill. Thousands of pages of incredibly complex and often opaque regulation that hardly anybody has read except me and a few very, very nerdy lawyers who plan to make a ton of money out of having read it. The most rapidly growing sector in the US economy today is compliance. It's the compliance departments that are growing fastest because they have to contend with this exponentially growing body of regulation. And this is a real problem. Let me try and show you why. The costs of law in the United States are exceptionally high. Tort law is a really good illustration of this. I think we're in the law school, aren't we? Or at least some law lectures happen here. Any lawyers in the audience? Sorry about this, guys. This is going to hurt you more than it hurts me. So the tort phenomenon is really bizarre, in which far more than in other English-speaking jurisdictions, you can find yourself on the wrong end of litigation for liabilities you never knew you had. I'll give you an illustration of the kind of craziness that characterizes the legal system today. A friend of mine recently received an email saying that he was a participant in a class action suit against Southwest Airlines. The suit contended that Southwest Airlines had violated the terms of their free drink vouchers in business class. A court case was heard in Chicago. The case, of course, had been brought by Chicago lawyers. And at the end of it, Southwest settled for a considerable sum. The people who were in the class action got drink vouchers. The lawyers made $3 million, like that. And this is just one of a great many of examples I could give you of a system that has become sick. It is sick that corporations find themselves dealing with this kind of problem on an almost daily basis. Ask the people at BP, do you know what the scale of damages is going to be that you have to pay for the deep water spill? They have no idea. It is completely open-ended at this point. And any attempt to try to find some finite boundary to the litigation seems doomed to fail, because to some degree it's become politicized. Don't take it from me that there's a problem with the American rule of law. Take it from the Fraser Institute. They're Canadians, so they're, of course, unbiased. The Fraser Institute looks at a whole different bunch of indicators of economic freedom. Look at the blue line here, which scores legal system and property rights, maximum 10. Really dramatic decline in the way that the US performs in this particular data set. Now you could say, what do they know? But every single systematic attempt to assess institutional quality in the world today comes to similar findings of a deterioration in the quality of American institutions. You don't need to base it on survey data. You can just look at how easy it is to do business according to the criteria that the World Bank uses. The World Bank measures 7 different procedures in the number of days it takes you to do it. So, for example, to start a business. It's good to hear that old Nokia ringtone. It's still going strong out here. It's almost nostalgic to hear it. And if that's my attorney, tell him I'm busy. So there's 7 different procedures which include getting an export license, all that kind of stuff. If you add them together, you get a kind of index for the ease of doing business in days. And then look at how much it's changed. So if you go back to 2006 and look at the change in the number of days, it's a percentage increase in the number of days it takes to do stuff. In almost all countries in the world, it's improved. In almost all countries in the world, it is easier to do business than it used to be. There are 21 where this is not true, and here are the bottom 10. And the United States is in the bottom 10. In that short space of time, it's got nearly 20% more time-consuming to do these 7 things. That puts you in good company. Hello, Burundi. Hello, Zimbabwe. The World Economic Forum takes a great deal of time to quantify institutional performance in its competitiveness index, which I cited earlier. So this is a deep dive into their data set. What I wanted to know was, in the 22 different measures of institutional quality, how does the US do? And the answer is terribly. It doesn't come top in any. It's only in the top 20 in one, investor protection, right at the bottom of the list. In 22 out of 22 measures of institutional quality, Hong Kong beats the United States. Maybe this doesn't come as a surprise to you. But I tell you, it comes as a pretty big surprise to most American audiences. And I could go on, because there's a lot of work out there that documents this fundamental problem of institutional degeneration. World Governance Indicators, a relatively recent project that the World Bank sponsors. Here are 5 different measures of governance quality for the United States going back to 1996. Look at the trend. Voice and accountability, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, control of corruption, all down. All down. And that's a sobering thing. By the way, this is not a partisan point. It's gone on regardless of which party has been dominant in Washington, D.C. When I say America is turning Latin, people from Mexico kind of bridle a bit, or from Brazil. And they're right to, because you know what? If you do a similar chart for Brazil, the trajectory is the opposite. Their institutional quality is improving. Ditto Mexico. Not Venezuela, not Argentina, but there are a bunch of Latin American countries doing better. This comes finally to the concluding thought. I've spent a lot of time emphasizing the problems that Western societies have. It's not just that the rest of the world is downloading the killer apps. I could live with that. In fact, I think it's great. It's the fact that the killer apps are deteriorating in the West. If you want to pursue the software analogy further, we're not really upgrading. Bugs are getting into the operating system. Do you ever own one of those PCs that after a while would take 10 minutes to boot up? You had to go and sort of make a cup of tea while the darn thing was whirring and buzzing, and a little hourglass would appear, and oh God, I'll never get this thing done. That's what I see. The killer apps are still there, but they're running like they're on some 1990s PC. Even as the rest of the world has switched to a Mac. But I don't want to leave you with the thought that it's all plain sailing in the rest of the world. Because you know what? Of all the killer apps, the rule of law may be the hardest to download. It's one thing to download good engineering. It's another thing to download the spirit of the rule of law. And I think this process whereby China grapples to embrace the rule of law the way Hong Kong already has is going to be bumpy. It is not a straightforward proposition for a one-party state to submit itself to the rule of law. It is not an easy thing for all-powerful local officials to accept that an independent judiciary may have power over them. That's what the rule of law boils down to. And that may be the hardest of all the killer apps to download. If you look at that World Governance Indicator data set again, the rule of law has a long way to go in Asia. Hong Kong is still doing well. Interestingly, according to this data set, Hong Kong's rule of law has improved markedly since 1996. Ditto Macau, ditto Singapore. But if you look at a bunch of other countries, including China, there's no progress at all. There may even be deterioration. Those governance indicators that look terrible for the United States, well, they don't look great for China. Needless to say, voice and accountability is abysmal. But the only thing that shows any really discernible upward trend is government effectiveness. The other stuff is below the zero line. And this, I think, is what is going to be really tough for China's new leadership. I have the impression that they understand the importance of this issue. It is more talked about than it used to be in Beijing, that law matters. It's inevitable as the middle class in China grows larger that the security of their private property rights will loom larger as a concern. But how easily the regime can address the desire for secure property rights without opening a Pandora's box of other rights, that seems to me to be the really key question. In short, there is still some light in the western gloom. This was my favorite photograph from last year. Hurricane Sandy sweeps the eastern seaboard. Only one building in Manhattan still has its lights on. You guessed it, Goldman Sachs. Anybody here planning to work for Goldman? I was going to say, you don't need a flashlight when you go to work there. Let me leave you with another Thatcher thought. Thatcher was somebody who studied law, though she was a chemist by academic training. She studied law before she went into politics as a young mother. In 1988, a huge issue, which I don't need to describe in detail, blew up. And it seemed as if the issue was going to be decided not in the courts, but on TV. It was Margaret Thatcher who used the phrase trial by television to condemn this trend. The freedom of peoples depends fundamentally on the rule of law, a fair legal system, she said. The place to have trials or accusations is a court of law, the common law that has come right up from Magna Carta, which has come right up through the British courts. A court of law is the place where you deal with these matters. In my Financial Times piece published this morning, I made the simple observation that to the great annoyance of most people on the left, including Financial Times journalists, Margaret Thatcher was in fact right about nearly everything. And she was right about the rule of law too. It's the hardest of the killer apps to download, and how successfully the PRC downloads it will determine exactly how far this great reconvergence goes. Thanks very much. Questions?
Yes, indeed. Questions.
Yeah, I had a question. First of all, I will briefly introduce myself. I'm Sarah Yugang Kim from Seoul. It was interesting to see our work ethic so high.
Yeah, it's impressive.
Yeah, thank you for the great lecture. It was very, very interesting, especially the metaphor that you used by killer apps. The most thing that I want to ask is, based on history, which you are specialized in, why do you think that Western countries first was able to establish the rule of law app? Because I think that could be kind of a guide or answer to the Asian countries or the rest of the world to download that app successfully. So I want to hear about that too. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a great question. It's exactly the right question to ask. And in a way, Margaret Thatcher gives you a clue here. Because the evolution of the rule of law in England was a protracted historical process dating back into the medieval period and beyond. That's the problem. When we come to study the common law system, which of course is what one finds also in Hong Kong because of the British influence here, one finds something that was not simply dreamt up by a committee of experts or in a 5-year plan, but instead something that evolved over centuries. And precisely because it evolved and was not designed, it has proved to be highly responsive to economic change. Let me illustrate that point with an example. In the 19th century, Charles Dickens.
This is when I become Jay-Z. In the 19th century, Charles Dickens, the great novelist, made fun of the English legal system in a novel, Bleak House, which I highly recommend. He ridiculed it as inefficient, corrupt, incredibly slow-moving. As you read that book, you think, how on earth did the Industrial Revolution happen in a country that had such a dysfunctional rule of law? Then you delve a little deeper, and you realize that Dickens was part of a reform movement, a movement to improve the rule of law and the efficiency of the courts, which bore fruit. Example, the railways, perhaps the signature technology of the Industrial Revolution after textile machinery. When the railways were first built, and they were first built in England, the only way to get the land to build a new railway was by an individual act of Parliament, which was a very cumbersome process. Over time, things changed until by the 1840s, a more utilitarian spirit in Parliament meant that railways could quite easily be established in single legislative acts, en masse, if you like. The law had adapted, and we can see that individual judges adapted in the same way to the economic change that was going on all around them. At the heart of the common law is the idea that individual property rights are sacrosanct, but there can be exceptions. And the railways illustrate that point well. We know from a great deal of literature that the common law has advantages, particularly for economic development, over civil law systems of the sort that we associate with France. Scholars argue back and forth about this, but I'm going to go, at least for this discussion, with the view that the common law has advantages, particularly for, say, investor protection. We know that the common law can be transplanted to other countries and cultures because that's what the British Empire did. But can it be transplanted, as it were, voluntarily? It was one thing for the British to impose their legal system on Hong Kong. But would it work if a foreign country tried to impose it on itself? Probably not. And most Chinese scholars today who write about this are quite careful to argue against transplanting European models into China, where a quite different tradition of law exists, a tradition in which the magistrate is in some ways inseparable personally from the official. The bottom line is that successful rule of law systems have evolved more organically than they've been created overnight. And it's very interesting to reflect on what South Korea has to teach us in this respect. Because after all, your country went from being a military dictatorship to a democracy very successfully. It went from being a poor country to being a rich country very successfully. I have yet to read a good account, maybe there is one and you can tell me about it, of how the rule of law changed in South Korea during that same period of transition. It's certainly something that China should be looking at, don't you think? Thanks. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor Ferguson, for your talk. My name is Alan, a graduate student in anthropology here in Chinese U. When the rest of the world downloaded these killer apps and become rich and rise in GDP, what also happened was the rise of inequality. And those wealth that are newly created concentrated on a few hands. And there's the same trend is not just in Hong Kong, China, the US as well. Does that rise of inequality worries you? Would that threaten our future? And my second question is that when we have these killer apps, say work ethics in consumer societies, is that a measure of social progress? Are we better off working longer and consuming clothes every day? And what was your view on that? And I was really surprised that not a single time you've mentioned the word inequality in your talk, and I think that is something that we ought to consider. Thank you.
Thanks for those two questions. You'll be glad to hear that the book talks about this issue in some detail. It just was something there wasn't time for this evening. Inequality is something that, of course, preoccupied Western critics of capitalism even before Marx burst on the scene. And when we look back at their critiques, it's very striking how wrong they were. They imagined, Marx and Engels and other Marxists, that the process of widening disparities in wealth would continue until finally there was just a tiny plutocratic elite and a vast impoverished proletariat. Unfortunately for the theory, this is not what happened at all. Indeed, from just about the time that Marx and Engels were writing, a quite different trend emerged. And that trend was, in fact, for there to be rising incomes, particularly among skilled workers, but not exclusively among skilled workers, and increasing redistribution through tax systems as franchises widened. The first step in this direction was, of course, free trade, which abolished the protection of agricultural elites and greatly lowered the cost of basic foodstuffs for the working class. That happened in 1846, which is just about the time, of course, that Marx and Engels were devising the Communist Manifesto. So, in fact, the Marxist analysis of how capitalism would work was wrong. The inequalities that initially, of course, opened up then diminished in the later 19th and early 20th century. You're frowning as if I'm telling you something that's not true, but actually the data are very clear on this. And of course, that trend continued until in the 1930s and 1940s, inequality really sharply diminished, partly because of the Great Depression and partly because of the World Wars, which were great levelers and really brought developed societies' inequality dramatically down. You're not shaking your head as if it's not true either, but I'm afraid it is true, and I'm happy to show you the data anytime you like. So what you have to remember is that most of what gets written about inequality today tends to take as its baseline the period of reduced inequality in the mid-20th century, which was a very anomalous time. The Great Depression was catastrophic for capitalists, for wealth owners. They really took a huge hit, particularly in the United States. And then World War II was a huge leveler. The wealthy were taxed at confiscatory rates. In the United Kingdom, marginal tax rates rose above 100% for upper incomes and incomes from investment. And one of the things that Margaret Thatcher was associated with was undoing much of that highly egalitarian tax policy in the same way that happened in the United States. You have to choose your baseline carefully. So when people say inequality has soared, they're usually taking far too short a time frame. What they mean is inequality has soared relative to the period immediately after World War II. It would be kind of amazing if it hadn't, actually. It would be really quite an achievement if we'd managed to maintain the levels of egalitarianism achieved during a total war right into the 21st century. Remember, inequality rises, measured by a Gini coefficient, if the poor stay dirt poor and the bourgeoisie begins to get wealthy and a very rich elite gets very wealthy. Would you rather we just stayed with everybody dirt poor? This has been tried. Egalitarian regimes successfully achieved equality by just preventing economic growth or ensuring that it was distributed in a completely equal way. It's hard to achieve growth without an increase in inequality. But the lesson of the 19th century experience is that after a certain point, the system in fact self-corrects. If China wants to have a domestic demand-led economy rather than export-led economy, it needs workers' wages to rise in real terms. That's the 5-year plan. That's the policy. It's not going to be a stable system if the Gini coefficient hits Brazilian levels. So I think one has to be very careful here to avoid the mistake that Marx made. Marx was projecting forward trends in the 1830s and 1840s that were about to be reversed. And I think we will see a reversal of the great inequality trend pretty soon in most emerging markets. You also asked about whether working hard and shopping are the only ways to achieve fulfillment. Well, I actually hate shopping. Although I quite like getting my suits made in Hong Kong, I do that mainly on economic grounds, not because I enjoy the process of going to Sam's the tailor. This is not an argument about what are the highest human values and how should we live the good life. My argument is really about how societies emerge from poverty. And what you do once you've got wealthy, if you want to be like the Germans and just go on vacation, that's fine by me. In many ways, the Germans have earned the vacations through very, very high productivity. But when one looks around the world at poor societies, if one had looked at China in 1978, the best answers to poverty are hard work and then the development of a consumer society, which will give that work a market. And it's still very hard to come up with a better formula than make cheaper clothes than the other guy. That seems to work pretty consistently everywhere it's tried.
Thank you, Professor Ferguson. I'm asking a question to somebody who's actually read your book, Civilization, and who uses it, part of it, in a general education course here at Chinese University. There's one question I have about one of your apps which has puzzled me ever since I read the chapter on the work ethic. You talk about the work ethic, but the way I understand your discussion of the work ethic, I see it as a kind of almost a disguised way of actually talking about Christianity. You link the two together very, very carefully, and indeed a particular kind of Christianity that emerges in around about the 16th century with the Reformation. Now, it just strikes me that, well, what I would like to know is how precisely you see the connection between the work ethic and Christianity, because many of the societies that are now displaying the most intense form of work ethic seem to have little or any historical connection with Christianity.
Thanks, and I'm really flattered that you used the book. Thanks. Though, of course, there are different ways of using a book. You can say, I want you to read this because it's really such complete, unmitigated rubbish. Hoping you don't do that. The inspiration for the work ethic chapter was, as I mentioned, Max Weber. And Weber's, and some of you probably read Weber, Weber's great insight, based on the tour of the United States, as I describe in the book, was that there was some link between Protestantism and what he called the ethic of capitalism. And this idea is a very appealing one. It kind of figures, and it figured to him. It makes a lot of sense to Scotsmen like me and Jim, because we kind of grew up in this culture of hard-working Calvinists, thrifty, capital-accumulating workaholics. So what Weber was really writing about was, in some ways, Weber himself, North German, overworked to the point of breakdown. The chapter that I wrote in the book was designed to take a step back and say, can this really be right? And the historical evidence suggests that Weber was right for the wrong reasons. Why does Protestantism matter? Is it, as Weber said, because it instills a certain set of drives that are different from, say, Confucianism? No. It turns out to matter because it makes people literate. The thing about Protestantism that distinguishes it from most other forms of religious activity is that the ability, except Judaism, the ability to read the scripture is crucial. And everybody has to be able to read the Bible for him or herself. And we now see that why Protestantism correlated to economic development was that those parts of Europe that embraced Protestantism had soaring literacy rates relative to those that didn't. And in fact, there's more empirical work since I published the book that shows just how powerful this effect is. Where Protestant missionaries went in the non-European world, literacy soared, and not where Catholic missionaries went. So you kind of needed your missionaries to be like David Livingstone to get the benefit. There is a connection, in other words, from the Reformation to economic development, but it's in the literacy, not in the moral content or the ethical drives that Protestantism gives you, which in any case Weber didn't understand that well when you come to read his essay. Final point, having arrived at this conclusion that the work ethic is really a literacy thing, and that therefore any culture can have the work ethic, it's really all about literacy plus incentives, I then went to Wenzhou. Some of you may know Wenzhou. Anybody actually from Wenzhou? So, I went to your hometown, and I was struck by two things. First, this seemed like the most free market economy in the world, the most entrepreneurial place. It was like stepping back into a kind of 19th century Scotland. Secondly, everywhere I looked, there were crosses, neon red crosses. And it turns out that Wenzhou is one of those places where evangelical Christianity is growing very fast. There are parts of China where this is true. So I looked a little bit more closely at this phenomenon, and it struck me as really amazing. I talked to some businessmen in Wenzhou. One of them said to me, he said, I'm a Christian, and one of the reasons that this is important is that when I do business, I trust other Christians much more than I trust non-Christian businessmen. And we have certain shared values which make it more straightforward to do business. I'm not worried about being cheated. So I suddenly thought to myself, could Max Weber be right after all? Is there in fact some relationship between that entrepreneurial spirit that one sees in Wenzhou everywhere and the kind of Christianity that Weber was talking about? So at the end of the book, I throw out this possibility that one of the most amazing trends in the world today, and one of the least talked about trends, is the rapid growth of Christianity in China. And this is a story to watch. Whether it will answer my question remains to be seen. That's why you identify a certain uncertainty. It's quite deliberately there. Thanks.
My name's Mark Sheldon here at the Chinese University. I'd like to ask you to speculate a little bit if China adapts most of the killer apps, but not the last one. We have a lot of experience here in the sort of engagement with China over the rule of law. And it's pretty clear that the other apps that you mentioned are aggressively and actively being enhanced and developed in the mainland. Certainly scientific method, certainly competition, certainly the others. But not the rule of law. It's rule by law, but not rule of law. So what is the model? What do you see? What's the scenario if that all goes forward with what we see in the projection of economic growth or development, but not under a rule of law system?
This is maybe a good note on which to end the discussion, because it allows me to be humble. One of the reasons I'm here and enjoying very much being here as part of the Morningside College and Chinese University communities is to find out the answer to that question. Because I really don't know, and I'm not an expert. Don't pretend to be an expert on China, but I know that's the question. That's the most important question for China today. And since I've been here, I've been amazed
at how lively the discussions have been that I've had, not only on campus but in town, on precisely the issue, can China transition from rule by law to rule of law? Can you have the rule of law when you only have a few 100,000 lawyers and no really independent judges? How can that be achieved? My hunch, one should always have a hunch, a hypothesis which you're ready to have falsified, a bit like my Weber hypothesis. My hunch is that you can't really sustain development and get out of the middle income trap if you don't make the transition to rule of law. Because from the point of view of those who've benefited from economic growth, private property rights can never be sufficiently secure. The temptation is always to get the money out. That's one of the ways in which the lack of rule of law ultimately impedes your future growth, because it diverts the capital elsewhere, and it doesn't go into the next phase of technological innovation. It goes into the London property market or Vancouver. So my hunch is that without the rule of law, China will hit a ceiling, and that the OECD story that I showed you in that slide, where the convergence goes all the way to less than 2-to-1 US to China's GDP, that story will not happen. Final thought. One obvious lesson of Western history is that when you create a large middle class, to use Marxist terms, the bourgeoisie, that has political consequences too. The middle class may not even want to be politically conscious, but by dint of having property and wanting to protect its property, it will behave in such a way as to promote a liberal agenda. It's almost an involuntary mechanism. Become rich, start to care about property rights. Care about property rights, start to care about other rights like political rights. That dynamic, which is so obvious in the European story, is going to happen in China. In fact, I think it's already happening. And that is probably the single biggest problem that the leadership faces. It's created the world's biggest middle class. And now, surprise, it's behaving like a middle class. It wants its property rights protected, and it bitches about corruption in the official class. These are the things that I find most interesting about mainland China today. One of the reasons I'm here, one of the reasons I'm going to spend the last week of the month in Beijing. I don't expect at all to find a definitive answer, but I do want to meet the people who are thinking about this, because, as I've said, this is the big, big question. People in the West who think it's all about democracy are missing the point. It's not. It's about the rule of law. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been a tremendously patient audience. You've put up with my excessively long answers to questions. Let me reiterate, it's a huge pleasure to be here. I hope I'll have a chance to interact with many of you in the time that I have remaining. Thanks very much.
I'm going to say thank you for a very stimulating occasion, and there are dozens of questions still. I do hope people can track it down. Thank you very much, and now we will demonstrate that by a suitably noisy piece of